On the mound, the legendary Leroy Satchel Paige. Arguably the greatest pitcher this sport has ever seen. We know for certain the oldest rookie in the history of Major League Baseball. Now, Major League Baseball says that Satchel was 42 years old when he finally got his opportunity to pitch in the major leagues with then the Cleveland Indians. Most who knew Satchel believed that he was at least 10 years older than he claimed to be. Satchel was likely born into the early to mid-1890s in Mobile, Alabama. And so that birth record was typically kept in the back page of the family Bible. And according to Satchel, the goat ate that page out the Bible. His original tombstone has a question mark by his birthday. Yeah, the old man literally took it with him to his grave. But when we talk about Satchel Paige, there is really no one to compare him to. Not someone who combines the longevity. By his estimation, he pitched in over 2,600 games. The great stuff. Recorded some 55 no-hitters and only God knows how many strikeouts. And the charisma. He could sell it. Yeah, he could sell it, but he could also back it up. There will never, ever, ever be another Leroy Satchel Paige. Satchel famously had names for his pitches. So he didn't have fastball, curveball, changeup. No, not Satchel. Satchel had what he called his midnight creeper. He had the two-humper. He had the bat dodger. He had the hesitation pitch. He had the long tom, the short tom, the jump ball, the trouble ball, the radio ball, the wobbly ball, the dipsy-do. And he also had a pitch that he famously called his B-ball. You know why he called it the B-ball? Because Satchel says, it bees where I want it to be when I want it to be there. And so he had all the stuff you needed to be a star, and he was just that. He was not only the Negro League's biggest and brightest star, but he was one of the biggest stars in baseball history. They clocked Satchel Paige unknowingly in a ball game in Griffith Stadium in D.C. Satchel retires aside, and the kid from the military comes over. Mr. Paige, we clock your fastball at 105 miles per hour. Satchel looks at the kid. He says, son, I wish I'd known you were timing me. I could have thrown harder than that. Yeah, you'll hear from the old Negro League players who saw Satchel in his prime that if anyone tells you they saw his fastball in the hitting zone, they're lying. Yeah, you might have seen it leave his hand, but by the time it got there to home plate, it literally was about the size of an aspirin tablet. What really made Satchel so special was 105 with pinpoint control. He could put it exactly where he wanted to put it, and I'm not talking about just throwing strikes. The catcher set the target. He hit the target. He didn't miss. You see, he didn't warm up in the bullpen like most pitchers do, throwing to the catcher across home plate. You know what Satchel would use? A stick of foil chewing gum wrapper. The catcher would sit the chewing gum wrapper on top of home plate. And wherever the catcher moved the chewing gum wrapper, Satchel right over the top of that chewing gum wrapper. And as Satchel would say, he'd work both corners of that chewing gum wrapper. He was absolutely uncanny. One of my favorite Satchel Paige stories involves the old man pitching in the Denver Post tournament. They're playing an all-white semi-pro team. The first kid from the semi-pro white team gets into the batter's box. Satchel throws him a fastball. He dribbles it down the third base line. It stays fair. The kid beats it out, gets an infield hit. Well, about that time, one of the kids from the opposing team steps into the dugout steps and says, let's beat him. He ain't nothing but an overrated darky. Well, Satchel Paige had a nickname for everyone. His nickname famously for the legendary Buck O'Neil was Nancy. That's a whole nother story. But anyway, Satchel looks over at first base and he says, "Nancy, did you hear that?" Buck said, "Yes, Satchel, I heard it." He said, "Nancy, bring him in." So Buck turns and motions for the outfield to take a couple of steps in. Satchel looks over at first base. He says, "Nancy, bring him all the way in." Honest to God's truth, there were 7 guys kneeling around the mound. And Satchel strikes out the side on 9 straight pitches. He looks into the opposing team's dugout and says, "Overrated Darky Hay." But the legendary Buck O'Neil always said if he had one game to win and any choice of any pitcher from any era, it would be the legendary Satchel Paige. He says you might beat him when he was out there messing around, but when he was locked in, forget about it. Now, Major League Baseball says that Satchel was 42 years old when he finally got his opportunity to pitch in the major leagues in 1948 with the Cleveland Indians. He, along with Larry Doby, would help Cleveland win the last World Series at that time that Cleveland had won. Many thought Satchel should have been named Rookie of the Year. He goes 6-1 with a 2.4 ERA his rookie season at age 42, which means he might have been closer to 52.
And in comes Cleveland ageless Satchel Paige to mount the mound for the Tribe.
Now, Satchel in 1965 is believed to be 59 years old if you believe he was born in 1906, which I do not, but for the sake of the story, we'll say that he was indeed born in 1906. He pitches 3 shutout innings against the Boston Red Sox, giving up only 1 hit in those 3 innings. Great trivia question. Who got that lone hit off of Satchel? The legendary Carl Yastrzemski. Yaz. Yaz gets a double against the old man. Satchel leaves him at third and shut down everybody else over 3 of the most remarkably pitched innings in baseball history. And they were all turning, going back into the dugout in utter disbelief that they couldn't hit that old man. Without question, Satchel Paige was the Negro League's biggest and brightest star. The man would ride into towns, and the entire towns would shut down to watch him pitch. Everyone wanted to see the old man do his thing. Was he a little bit disheartened when he wasn't the first to break baseball's color barrier? Of course he was, because in many ways, he was the Negro Leagues. And I'm not sure there's any more lore or legend surrounding any one athlete. Perhaps it's because we don't really know how old he truly was, and because he dazzled us for decades. By the time he ended his career, he was either 59 or maybe 69 years old, and he was still getting it done. Only the immortal Leroy Satchel Paige. Hailing from Giddings, Texas, is one of the greatest pitchers you likely never heard of, Hilton Lee Smith. Hilton Smith was a great pitcher, primarily for the Kansas City Monarchs. And Hilton Smith pitched alongside the legendary Satchel Paige, and they were polar opposites. When Satchel walked in the room, the room lit up. You knew he was in the room, and if you didn't know, he was going to let you know that he was in the room. Hilton Smith was the exact opposite, very quiet, very workmanlike, unassuming, but just as lethal, possessing what many believe to be the greatest curveball this sport has ever seen. Hilton Smith was indeed the truth. Buck O'Neil believed that Hilton Smith had the greatest curveball this sport has ever seen. The legendary Monty Irvin would go on to say that it was the greatest curveball that he had the displeasure of ever trying to hit. He threw the big 12-6 breaker, and he threw what he called a tight curveball, where he would drop down 3/4, and he threw it all with pinpoint control. As a matter of fact, Monty Irvin would go on to say that you could know where his curveball was coming from, and the break and bite on it was so sharp, you still couldn't hit it. Hilton Smith was one of many great two-way stars in the Negro Leagues. And over recent times, we've become enamored by the nature of two-way stars, primarily because of the great success of Shohei Ohtani. Well, the Negro Leagues were filled with great two-way stars, and Hilton Smith was just one of many. And what made Hilton so special was when he wasn't pitching, he played the outfield and had a lifetime batting average over 300. His first game in Kansas City, his first full season with the Monarchs in 1937, what did Hilton Smith do? He only threw a perfect game. Yeah, he blanked the Chicago American Giants 4-0. Hilton Smith had that great breaking ball and then a dominating fastball to go on top of it. You've got to sit on his fastball, and then you had virtually no chance of hitting his curveball. That went along with a repertoire of other great pitches, but the curveball was the pitch that really made Hilton Smith unhittable. Hilton Smith did something that I don't think we will ever see done in the game of baseball again. Hilton Smith won 20 games or more, 12 consecutive years. He goes 6-1 in exhibition games against Major League All-Stars. He was likely the best pitcher in all of baseball at that time, who by the time that Jackie Robinson breaks Major League Baseball's color barrier, he realized that he was too old. The majors came calling, but he knew by that time he was too old to cross over that threshold and go into Major League Baseball. Hilton Smith earned a reputation as being Satchel's shadow, the legendary Satchel Paige. He would oftentimes come in and relieve Satchel. Well, Satchel was the draw. So Satchel's going to pitch 2 or 3 innings. And who came in and pitched the last 6 or 7? Hilton Smith. And all the old timers in the Negro League say, if you're going to get anything, you better get it off of Satchel because you weren't going to touch Hilton Smith. It is Hilton Smith who is credited with having introduced or recommended Jackie Roosevelt Robinson to Kansas City Monarchs owner James Leslie Wilkinson. Hilton had seen Jackie playing against a white military baseball team that had major league players on it in 1942. He quickly recommended Jackie to Monarchs owner James Leslie Wilkinson. When Jackie gets discharged from the military in 1944, he writes to Monarchs owner J.O. Wilkinson, and Wilkie gives him a tryout. He makes the team, and he joins the Kansas City Monarchs in 1945. Many credit Hilton Smith for introducing us to the man that would break Major League Baseball's 6-decade-long self-imposed color barrier. Andrew Foster, a.k.a. Rube the Genius. Rube Foster, without question, the greatest baseball mind this sport has ever seen, and virtually no one knows anything about it, even though he is rightfully enshrined in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Rube Foster is that rare baseball personality that would have checked all 3 boxes in terms of Hall of Fame credential. Oh yeah, he would have gone in the Hall of Fame as a pitcher, as a manager, and as an executive. But Foster was best known as this visionary, this tremendous leader. He would organize the Negro Leagues in a meeting held in Kansas City, Missouri at the Paseo YMCA on February 13, 1920. he would rally 8 independent black baseball team owners together. And somehow or another, he convinced them that in order for black baseball to succeed, they needed an organized body. Rube would become president of the Negro Leagues. Rube Foster arguably is the most influential person in baseball history, simply for what he did in forming the Negro Leagues. Rube Foster is believed to have created what we now know to be the screwball. Back then it was called a fadeaway, and Rube perfected this pitch. So much so that the great Major League manager, John McGraw, would sneak Rube into his camp so that Rube Foster could teach Christy Mathewson how to throw the screwball. Christy Mathewson threw the pitch all the way into the National Baseball Hall of Fame that he learned from Rube Foster. He earned his nickname Rube as a youngster, there from Calvert, Texas, when he beat the great major leaguer Rube Waddell in a head-to-head matchup, and the nickname stuck. He also had the full repertoire to go along with this unique pitch that he created called back then a fadeaway. And so, yeah, Rube doesn't get nearly enough credit for having been one of the most dominant pitchers in black baseball history. Rube Foster owned the Chicago American Giants, and he managed the Chicago American Giants. And his savviness, his craftiness, his astuteness of the game allowed him and his teams to dominate the early era of black baseball. Rube assembled some of the greatest talent in black baseball history for his teams, where he served as both player and manager. He knew great talent. He knew how to go out and recruit great talent and build the kind of chemistry with that great talent of stars, thoroughbreds, who could flat out get the job done. As a manager, Rube Foster was known to fine his ball players as much as $5 at the turn of the early 1900s if you were tagged out standing up. You were supposed to slide. Rube would draw a circle down the first base line and a circle down the third base line. And if every one of his players couldn't drop a bunt inside the circle, Rube would fine them. Oh, you were going to see great baseball. Oh, but yeah, you were going to be thoroughly entertained watching Rube Foster's brand of baseball. Rube Foster was adamant about the style of play that would become signature Negro Leagues baseball. Fast, aggressive, daring. They would bump their way on. They would steal second. They would steal third. And if you weren't too smart, they were stealing home. And this was a brand of baseball that was drawing both black and white fans who were sitting side by side, where during that era of segregation, that was virtually unheard of. Yeah, now Rube was light years ahead of his time. The Negro Leagues were born out of segregation, and there was a simple mindset behind it. You won't let me play with you in the major leagues, then I'll create my own league. And Rube essentially did what others had attempted to do, but they had failed. But Rube had the wherewithal to get it done. And how he convinced those other 8 independent black baseball team owners to come together is a true testament to Rube's ability to sell this vision. And that's exactly what they did, having established the Negro National League, the first successful organized black baseball league. Rube Foster stood there and boldly proclaimed, "We are the ship, all else the sea." He was serving notice to Major League Baseball that a new player had arrived on the scene to be reckoned with. That's why I say that Rube Foster is without question the most influential person in baseball history. Hank Thompson is one of baseball's barrier breakers. although so many folks have never heard of who this legendary ball player was. Hank Thompson, along with his Monarch teammate Willard Brown, would join the St. Louis Browns in 1947. They would become the first two African-American teammates in the modern era of Major League Baseball to play on a Major League team. Just shortly after Jackie Robinson, Larry Doby had integrated both the National League and American leagues, respectively. They all were part of breaking baseball's color barrier. But Hank Thompson, he had all the tools to be a superstar. Henry Hank Thompson is a tremendously underrated baseball player. He joins the Kansas City Monarchs at age 17 and became almost an instant star, playing the infield, primarily third base. But Hank Thompson was also a war hero. He was a machine gunner during World War II, fought in the Battle of the Bulge. When he was discharged from the military in 1946, resumed a great career right the moment he gets back with the Monarchs. Hank Thompson had stardom written all over him. Hank Thompson had all the tools you needed to be a great star. He was essentially a five-tool third baseman who hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, and could throw. Played a dazzling infield, primarily third base. Yeah, that's how good Hank Thompson was. The St. Louis Browns thought that Hank Thompson and Willard Brown would do for them what Jackie had done for Brooklyn in terms of black fans coming over to watch the Browns play. And so they never got a fair shot with the St. Louis Browns. Hank Thompson and Willard Brown both realized that they had left a team in the Kansas City Monarchs who were far better than the St. Louis Browns. Hank Thompson comes back home to Kansas City and immediately puts up huge numbers. Shortly thereafter, the New York Giants come calling. And Henry Thompson again would break barriers by becoming the only player to integrate two Major League teams, the St. Louis Browns and the New York Giants. In 1946, when Bob Feller and Satchel Paige hook up in an epic barnstorming tour from East Coast to West Coast, right after the World Series in 1946. Bob Feller had his All-Stars, and the legendary Satchel Paige had his Satchel Paige All-Stars. We're talking the creme de la creme on both teams. Satchel's lineup was stacked. Buck O'Neil, Quincy True, Willard Brown. And according to Bob Feller, the best of the bunch on that Satchel Paige All-Star team was a young Hank Thompson. Thompson would then go on to face in a game against Larry Doby, where they become the two first black players to compete against one another in Major League Baseball. Oh, but there's more. Hank Thompson would face the great Don Newcombe, and it would be the first time that a black hitter had faced a black pitcher in Major League Baseball history. And of course, Hank Thompson, Willie Mays, and the great Monty Irvin would form the Major's first all-black outfield, even though Hank Thompson was an infielder by trade. His versatility made him very special. Henry Thompson's career was cut so short by some of his own doing, and he would be the first, if he was still with us, to tell you that he lived his life in such a way that it really did kind of hurt his professional baseball career. He only plays 9 years in the major leagues. And again, it's so unfortunate that his career was cut so dreadfully short that it never got to play out in the fashion in which Henry Thompson would be the first to say that he wished it would have had things worked out maybe a little bit differently. Henry suffered a lot of darkness during his childhood that unfortunately carried over into his playing career that really hindered him from having what I believe would have potentially been a Hall of Fame caliber career. John Jordan O'Neill, affectionately known as Buck. Buck joined the Monarchs in 1938, where he began a love affair with Kansas City. As Buck would say, he fell in love with Kansas City, and Kansas City loved him back. And it would be an affiliation that he would have with the Monarchs from 1938 through the end of the 1955 season. Buck would later become a player-manager with the Monarchs before leaving to go join the Chicago Cubs as a scout. And as a scout, he signed Hall of Famers Ernie Banks, Lou Brock, and Lee Arthur Smith to their first professional baseball contract. And then Buck himself would break barriers in Major League Baseball by becoming the first African-American coach in Major League Baseball history with the Chicago Cubs in 1962. And he said of his pioneering role, "I was very proud to be the first black coach. But he says, I couldn't stick out my chest because I knew all of these other great black baseball minds from the Negro Leagues who were more than capable of waving a guy home." When Buck joined the Monarchs in 1938, he became their go-to guy at first base. He was a great first baseman, a tremendous defensive first baseman with line drive power, and was always a great clutch hitter and a natural-born leader of men. Buck O'Neill had huge hands, but soft hands, great range, and great instinct. As a matter of fact, Buck delighted in letting you know that one season alone, he had one error the entire season. If you got it over to Buck, he was going to pick it because he could flat out pick it. All of those attributes helped make him one of the greatest defensive first basemen in Negro Leagues history. People often ask Buck O'Neill, what was your greatest day in baseball? And he would just light up like a Christmas tree in remembering Easter Sunday, 1943. The Kansas City Monarchs opened the season against the Memphis Red Sox. Buck would say the first time up, he doubled. The second time up, he singled. The third time up, he hit the ball over the left center field fence. The fourth time up, he hit the ball. It looked like it's going over the left center field fence. He's running the bases saying to himself, hit the fence, hit the fence, hit the fence. The ball does hit the fence. It ricochets between the left fielder and the right fielder. Buck gets to third base. They're waving him home. He could have gotten an inside the park home run, but he stopped because he wanted to hit for the cycle. Well, that evening, the Monarchs' traveling secretary, a guy by the name of William Dismuke, everybody called him Dizzy. Well, Dizzy had invited some young school teachers over to the hotel to have dinner with the ball players. He knocks on Buck's door. He says, Buck, I got some people downstairs I want you to meet. He walks into the restaurant. He says he walks right over to a young lady. He says, my name is Buck O'Neill. What's yours? She was Ora Lee Owens. They were married for 51 years. So he hit for the cycle and met his future wife of 51 years. I'd say that's a pretty good day. It's really interesting that Buck O'Neill won his only batting title in 1946 after being discharged from World War II, where he had served in the U.S. Navy's Subic Bay, Philippines. And maybe we owe Uncle Sam for the reason that Buck O'Neill was burning that ball up when he got home. Clearly, Buck was glad to be back on U.S. soil. He had always been a clutch hitter, line drive hitter with great power. But in 1946, he put it all together and actually helped lead the Kansas City Monarchs into the 1946 Negro League World Series. people would sometimes come up to him and say, well, Buck, it's a shame that you didn't get a chance to play in Major League Baseball after Jackie breaks the color barrier. And Buck would simply look at them and say,
oh, I was right on time.
had I been later, I wouldn't have seen Babe Ruth. I wouldn't have played with and against the likes of Josh Gibson and Satchel Paige. And so, no, I was right on time. I played when I was supposed to play. Don't feel sorry for me. Feel sorry for the people who didn't see me play. They're the ones who missed out. Buck O'Neil was the consummate glass half full kind of guy.
The greatest thing in all of my life is loving you.
Loving exactly where he was at that particular time and living life to his very fullest as it was taking place. I think we should all take a page from Buck O'Neil. When I met Buck in 1993, one of the first questions that I posed to him was, what motivated you to want to build a Negro Leagues Baseball museum? And his answer was succinct, but very poignant, so that we would be remembered. And that is the quest of this great museum, to make sure that baseball's unsung heroes will never be forgotten, that those who forged a glorious history in the midst of an inglorious time in American history will be remembered. You could make the case that Buck O'Neil was baseball's greatest ambassador. What Buck accomplished over a tremendous 7-decade career as a great player, as a tremendous manager, as a groundbreaking scout and groundbreaking coach in Major League Baseball, and then the work that he did to build the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum makes Buck's career one of the most impactful careers in baseball history. I think you're hard-pressed to tell the story of baseball without including Buck O'Neil. In many ways, Jackie Roosevelt Robinson was the beginning, but also the end. He was the beginning of change, not only in baseball, but in American society. His breaking of the color barrier also signaled the end of the Negro Leagues. And a lot of people don't know that Jackie Robinson's illustrious professional baseball career began in Kansas City in 1945 with the Kansas City Monarchs. The question that is so commonly posed to me is, was he the best player in the Negro Leagues? And the answer is no. There were other Negro League veterans who were far superior baseball players to Jackie Robinson. And that is not to disparage Jackie Robinson, because he is one of the greatest athletes in American sports history. He was a four-sport star at UCLA. Baseball was his weakest sport, but Jackie Robinson was absolutely the right man to be the first. So he's college educated. He had served in the military. He was disciplined. He would become married to the beautiful Rachel Robinson. He was stable. You see, Jackie had what I like to refer to as the intangible that better prepared him to deal with the immense racial hatred that he would be confronted with, which is part of the reason why he was the chosen one to break Major League Baseball's color barrier. Certainly, in my own opinion, had it not been for World War II, I don't think Jackie Robinson gets invited to try out for the Monarchs. The Monarchs roster had been decimated by World War II. Buck O'Neil serving in the Navy. Hank Thompson, he's serving in the Army. Monarchs Hall of Fame outfielder Willard Brown is serving in the Army. So if the Monarchs have their full roster intact, Jackie Robinson never gets invited to try out. And how would history have been altered? Jackie Robinson would make his Kansas City Monarch debut on May 6, 1945. He goes 1 for 4 with a run-scoring double and stole a base in the Monarchs' win over the Chicago American Giants. He's often right. He would put together a stellar 1945 season with the Monarchs, one worthy of him being invited to play in the East-West All-Star game. Of course, by the end of that 1945 season, Jackie had disappeared. He was plucked away by the Brooklyn Dodgers. Jackie did not like his time in the Negro Leagues. And it wasn't because he didn't have great respect for the talent that was there in the Negro Leagues. Jackie Robinson hated the fact that he had to play in a Negro League. Jackie's mindset was that if I have the talent, I should be able to play in whatever league is available to me. And Jim Crow did not sit very well with Jackie Robinson. He was Los Angeles. He's California. So he wasn't accustomed to some of the things that the players in the Negro Leagues were having to endure. Long bus rides, going into towns where you weren't sure where you could get something to eat or have a place to stay. So life in the Negro Leagues left a bit of a sour taste in Jackie Robinson's mouth.
In the Dodger half of the second, Jackie Robinson leads off.
Well, Jackie Robinson was a tremendously gifted athlete. He quickly adopted that style of play that was signature of Negro Leagues baseball. Bold, brash, aggressive. And that's what he took with him over to Major League Baseball. And he was driving Major League pitchers crazy by stealing bases and particularly his knack for stealing home. And of course, that was his nod to the Negro Leagues. Jackie Robinson walks out on that field on April 15, 1947, and I draw the parallel of Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier to carrying the same euphoria that we saw as a nation when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And for black folks, Jackie Robinson's debut with the Brooklyn Dodgers, he became the first man to walk on the moon. 21 million black folks were counting on him and carrying the weight of an entire race, being thrust into a world where no one wanted you to be there. It was just a thing of beauty. It was electrifying, and it was exciting, and it was truly captivating. We were counting on Jackie to succeed, because his success was seen as advancement for a race of people who had been belittled for so long. That is an enormous amount of pressure for any one man to have to bear. In a game that is predicated on failure, he can't fail. Who knows how long it would have been before another black man would have gotten the opportunity to play in the major leagues. Somehow, Jackie Robinson summoned the will to perform at an incredible level. He earns the very first Rookie of the Year award, and he did so carrying the weight of an entire race of people on his shoulders. Here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, we make the bold assertion that Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier wasn't just a part of the Civil Rights Movement, it was the beginning. This is 1947. This is before Brown versus the Board of Education. This is before Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus. As my dear friend, the late great Buck O'Neill would so eloquently say, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was merely a sophomore at Morehouse College when Robinson signs his contract to play in the Brooklyn Dodgers organization. President Harry S. Truman would not integrate the armed forces until a year after Jackie. So for all intents and purposes, this is what started the ball of social progress rolling in our country. So for those of you who subscribe to the belief that one person cannot invoke change, you need to look no further than one Jackie Robinson.
Fans, opposing players, he talked about all the people who are going to be anti. He said we're going to have some people on our side, but we really are not going to have very many allies. We're going to have to do this thing simply by the box score.
What Satchel Paige was for the Negro Leagues, John Wesley Donaldson was for pre-Negro Leagues history, early era of black baseball. One of the greatest pitchers to ever toe the mound, a dazzling left-handed pitcher whose feats were, I guess you could say, something right out of a video game. 3 consecutive no-hitters, over 400 verifiable wins, over 5,000 career strikeouts. And yet it's hard to believe that very few folks have heard of the great John Donaldson. For those of you who may be hearing the term barnstorming for the first time, as it relates to baseball, it just simply means that they were taking baseball to towns and places around the globe that had not seen this brand of professional baseball. And the Negro Leaguers were heralded barnstormers. As a matter of fact, the legendary Satchel Paige would credit John Donaldson for sparking his desire to want to barnstorm the country. John Donaldson was essentially a hired hand. Truthfully, it would be easier to tell you the places that he didn't pitch than it would be to tell you all the places that he did pitch. And it's so unfortunate that the color of his skin prevented this man from showcasing his dazzling skills against all of the great players in this game. You only wonder, what if he'd gotten his chance, and just how special would John Donaldson have been? I, for one, believe that John Donaldson would have been one of the greatest pitchers to ever play this game. What made John Donaldson so special, number one, he was a southpaw, and he is likely the guy who invented what we now know to be the slider. Yet John Donaldson was throwing that pitch 20 years before anyone knew anything about it. He was hard to hit. No one had seen stuff quite like John Donaldson. John Donaldson could get the ball up to home plate as fast as anyone. And yes, it is true that one of his fastballs broke the hand of his catcher. I'm sure his catcher was not excited about that. And like a lot of the guys who were catching these guys like John Donaldson and Satchel Paige, you had to find a little something extra to create padding to try and protect your mitt with the catcher's mitt. And it was just hard for the opposition to catch up with that fastball of John Donaldson. When Satchel Paige says that he emulates you, then you pretty well know that he had to be a great showman, and John Donaldson was all of that and more. Like most who played in the Negro Leagues, they understood that this game was indeed entertainment, and Donaldson was the show, and people came to see the show, and he always delivered. This is where Satchel Paige got a lot of his antics, and we know the stories of how Satchel Paige would call the outfielders in and sit the infielders down. But try this on for size. In South Dakota, John Donaldson, one by one, started to call in his players to end up striking out the side. He knew he had the stuff, and he wanted to show off that great stuff, and people flocked to see him do his thing. By the time John Donaldson gets to the Kansas City Monarchs, he is really beyond his prime. But don't get it twisted. John Donaldson was not only a great pitcher, John Donaldson was also a great two-way star in black baseball history and in the Negro Leagues with the Kansas City Monarchs. His skill set was incredible. A great hitter who you could rely on to come in and get the job done on the mound as well, because he was indeed one of the great two-way stars of the Negro Leagues. James Leslie Wilkinson, who owned the Kansas City Monarchs, believed that John Donaldson was the greatest pitcher in Kansas City Monarch history. He was a left-hander with a dominating fastball, great curve, and a full repertoire of other pitches that, like most great pitchers, he could absolutely throw everything for strikes. Now, mind you, J.L. Wilkinson had Hall of Famers Hilton Smith, Wilbur, Bullet Joe Rogan, Jose Mendez, and of course, the legendary Leroy Satchel Paige. And he was perhaps the most fond of John Donaldson. Now, part of that may have been because John Donaldson made J.L. Wilkinson a lot of money, because Wilkinson was literally hiring Donaldson out. And it's seemingly everywhere that Donaldson went, he dazzled. Yeah, he was a special, special ball player. And it's hard to believe that a ball player of this magnitude, very few folks have ever heard about. The great Martin Dihigo is not a household name. Oh, but he should be. Because there are many who believe that Martin Dihigo is the greatest baseball player of all time, black or white. One thing that we do know, he is the most versatile baseball player in the history of this sport. Oh yeah, played all 9 positions and played all 9 of them well. 1938, he wins the pitching title. He posts an 18-2 record with a microscopic 0.90 ERA. But oh, it gets better. He hits .387 that same season and won the batting title as well. How is it possible that we don't know the name of a player of this magnitude? The year is 1938 in Mexico, and 2 pitching combatants are going at it. One was the name of the legendary Satchel Paige. The other, a young player from Cuba by the name of Martin Dihigo. Toe-to-toe, blow for blow, in the Mexican heat. They pitch to a 1-to-1 duel when the heat finally gets to Satchel, but Dihigo still goes strong. And eventually, it would be Martin Dihigo who would handle his own business and hit a walk-off home run to win the game for himself. Young Martin Dihigo was not unlike most young baseball players who struggle hitting the curveball. Well, as my friend Buck O'Neill would say when a reporter once asked him, said, "Mr. O'Neill, how do you hit a great curveball?" Buck O'Neill's reply was, by not missing the fastball. It took a young Martin Dihigo a little while before he caught on to the nuances of trying to hit a curveball. Oh, but when he did, he raked everything. And he was hitting line drives all over the place. He was hitting mammoth home runs that some would estimate would travel as much as 500 feet. He worked himself into being more than just a serviceable hitter of that curveball, to the point where he became a great curveball hitter. The great Martin Dihigo, a throwing arm that many says not only rivaled, but surpassed the arm of Roberto Clemente. To have an arm that was even remotely compared to Roberto Clemente is the ultimate compliment. But to have one that some say surpassed Clemente, that's next level. Oh, it just makes you wish you could have seen it. Martin Dihigo grew from a skinny kid from Cuba into a statuesque athlete, or as Monty Irvin would say, a beautiful ball player. Movie star good looks, tall, strong, one tremendous baseball player, and he speaks to the immense talent that was there in the Negro Leagues. But more importantly, he speaks to the fact that the Negro Leagues did not care what color you were. They welcomed any and everyone who could play. Thanks to the tutelage of great Negro League stars like Oscar Charleston, who spent quite a bit of time playing in Cuba, took a young Martin Dihigo under his wing and helped teach him the art of playing this game. Martin set new standards there in the Negro Leagues, standards that we still tout to this very day. Hall of Famer Buck Leonard, who was a star for the Homestead Grays, made it very clear that by his estimation, the great Martin Dihigo was not only the greatest black baseball player, but the greatest baseball player of any color. El Inmortal, or some would say El Maestro, the master, because he could do it all. He is the only baseball player in the history of our sport to be enshrined into 5 different countries' baseball halls of fame. He's in the Mexican, Cuban, Venezuelan, Dominican, and in Cooperstown.